Hello and welcome. This video is brought to you by Dave over at ATI. Dave is the person that replied to my email when I emailed them in regards to this size 6 LPVO. So Dave, thank you very much for sending this in. The first thing we're going to take note of is it does the exact same thing the SIG 6T first focal plane did, which in really dark environments with too bright of illumination, you do get some sort of reflection coming back from the illumination. Happily, however, when you have it at more or less the proper brightness setting, it's a non-issue. And with that, enjoy the rest of this section.
Pew, pew. Pew, pew. 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 Pew pew. Pew, pew.
Before we get too into the specifics of this thing, let's talk about the reticle. And the reticle on this thing, they simply call the CX9001 Rapid Aiming Feature Reticle. That's a mouthful. I actually have the box in front of me because I can't remember it because it's too long and I'm too impatient to write it down. This one is calibrated in 5.56. They do offer a 7.62 calibrated version if you're interested in that as well. The reticle as a whole I don't mind, but it could be vastly improved in my opinion. Regardless to how they have the setup, which is specifically for farther engagements, at 1x it gets lost in translation. It's pretty small. But you already have posts at 3, 6, and 9, so extend them to at least full length and make them a little bit thicker like what Night Force does with the Attacker. This way it's a lot easier to see. As far as why SAI opted to go with illuminating the entire center reticle as opposed to a very bright center dot, Dave said it was just because they wanted the illumination to include the drops. This way, if you're using this thing in darker environments at longer distances, you can use it efficiently and effectively as it was intended. So, because this thing was designed to be this way and this way very particularly, I can at least appreciate that. And you know what? In that regard, it works extremely well. I'm getting a little tongue-tied over here. Illumination, as you've already seen in darker environments, is more than adequately bright. In fact, it gets a little bit too bright. As you're going to see when we start going into brighter environments, you're going to notice that the illumination isn't full daytime bright. It's daytime noticeable. And for a lot of people out there, it's more than adequate because it's enough to create contrast between a black reticle and a black target or a very hard to see target. And for a lot of people I know specifically, that's going to be more than sufficient. I, for myself, don't mind that as long as I have larger posts to help guide it towards the center because I'm a very visual person and it would help greatly with target acquisition. All joking aside, these turrets are among the best I've ever gotten my hands on. I would love to have an MPVO with these turrets with larger caps on it because I think it would be incredible.
SAI Optic 6. I got this lined up as close as I can get it. This is a mil reticle. I don't know what the exact drops are, but we will see how well this thing does. This does have 0.1 mil increments. You can see we are just on either side of that line, so we'll start there. And let's do a little box test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3. It's a little hard. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's just a little hard because I literally don't have the space in here for my hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's actually pretty good. Now, I can't see the windage knob, so I'm just going to get lined up back where it was, which is right there. That looks good. And let's just keep on cranking. 10. 10. 10. 10. 10. 10. Ha 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 ha. Illumination on full down here is pretty damn good.
So, as you could hear, they sound incredible, they feel incredible, and it tracks incredibly well. Truly, truly sensational. I understand why they put such small turrets on this thing, because it saves on weight, saves on space, so it's a win-win. But it can be a little bit finicky when you're trying to do really precise stuff, but once you set it, you're going to forget it. And with that, let's start seeing how this thing performs in some other aspects. On the left, we have this. On the right, we have the 6T first focal plane, and we're doing the fore and aft test. So this is both at 6x magnification. With the 6T, you could see that the image quality greatly degrades as we change our Eyebox on it. Meanwhile, the only thing we have to deal with the size 6 is it just gets a little bit more scope shadow. But as far as the overall sharpness goes and field of view, it's very, very little difference. Very good so far. But let's see how much sort of distortion we have to the glass. Now, usually on first focal planes, they're okay, but a lot of the best second focal plane optics will have almost no distortion of a very flat image. Here you could already see that the lines are very well lined up with the view that we have through the optic versus what we have in real life. Now, there is a bit of a shift, both top, middle, and bottom, but it's so minute you probably won't notice it unless you're actually looking for it. And I'll illustrate this again when we get to the Smallbore range, but it's very, very minimal, which is great. We have a very flat image, which is something I am a huge fan of, because it doesn't pull you out of the experience or make you sick every time you look through this thing. With that being said, though, the reticle is still fairly small, and it just gets lost in translation, even like this. It's not even like we're in a big, crazy-looking environment. So, SAI, if you're watching this, which I know you're going to be watching this because I'm going to send you the link to this video when I'm done, at least extend those posts full length, please. Please, that's all I ask. That would really change the dynamic of this optic so much. I feel it would make it really usable without pulling away from the core values of this thing, which is for, more precise long-range shooting. Illumination here is on full, and like I said earlier, it is daytime noticeable. It's definitely bright enough to create good contrast between a dark reticle and a dark target or a dark environment. Granted, this is neither of those, but you could still pick it out on this dark gray power transformer here at 30 yards. So it's better than I've seen on a lot, but it's not the best. It's nowhere near as bright as the Leupold Mark 6 or the Gen 3 Razor. However, it doesn't have what those two optics had optical issue-wise, which I'll get to later on in the video when I do a slight comparison. Now, as much as I would have liked to have seen a very bright center dot on this, Dave brings up a very good point. With it being first focal plane, it would get so small at 1x you would barely notice it, and it might not be bright enough to even pick up, whereas at 6x it would be really large. And I get that. That's why the Leupold Mark 6 and the Gen 3 Razor had the big dot in the center and then that little segmented circle around it. It really throws things off. But Dave did also mention that they're thinking about coming out with a next generation LPVO technology, which would be kind of what March does, which having the reticle on the first focal plane and the illuminated reticle on the second focal plane. However, that adds a lot of complexity, and complexity adds cost. And they really wanted to have this thing hit a certain price point, and I think as a result, they managed to do Everything they were looking to get at the right price point extremely well. Enough about that, let's look at the image. So far, here at 6X, we're greeted with a very beautiful looking image. The only real optical issue that this thing has is very, very, very minor chromatic aberration that you can see between the windows, the posts in between the windows, and the parapet wall. But that's within well within acceptable levels for myself. Having a little bit like this is not a big issue, but having something like we saw, namely on the Steiner T5Xi, that was really bad, the 5-25. And I understand why some manufacturers purposely induce chromatic aberration to help you figure out where the lines are in hard to read contrast areas, but I'd much rather have as good a representation of an image through an optic as possible. But again, that comes down a lot to personal preference. Keeping it inside the upper limits of the drop reticle on this thing, we are now focusing our attention at our 800-yard power tower off in the distance. We still have a very good looking image. We do see a little bit of chromatic aberration at the 30-yard power lines, and they are a slight bit out of focus, but again, this being a first focal plane, you don't need to be at your maximum magnification at any time to be able to use the drops, which is one of the benefits of having a first focal plane LPVO to begin with. As for myself, I still think I prefer a second focal plane 1-6, but that's just me. Now, all of this really bright, sunny, clear day stuff is great, but how does it work in a very low light environment like we have here? It's clearly around 7:30, mid-spring, sun's well over the horizon. You can see a beautiful red tint to the sky. It was gorgeous, beautiful, like mid-60s. Fantastic. Here at 1X, you can see through the optic versus what we see on the outside, which was very little. We have about the same amount of light transmission. Slowly bringing this up to 6X here at 400 yards, we still see plenty of detail on that brick building. You could see all the panes of windows. You could see all the panes of glass on the window. You could see the AC compressors up there with relatively good clarity and contrast. So even if you're using this thing in darker environments, you can use it fairly efficiently. If you're using it with night vision, I assure you have even a better time with it. But because I don't have night vision yet, this is the best I have to offer. My home away from home, the 50-yard line at my local range. This is where we're going to go over basically all the little minutia parts of this thing and really see how well it's going to work in front of your eye. So far, we've seen this thing has very good sharpness, very good image quality, good brightness, okay reticle. Illumination is adequate for what they were trying to achieve. In fact, it's very good for what they were trying to achieve as far as a more precision-oriented reticle. As far as any sort of image shift, like we saw earlier, there's a very, very minor amount, but you'd have to really be looking for it to really notice it. Again, a very good performance. Not the best, but for what it is, it's very good. Almost all the other first focal plane LPVOs I've gotten my hands on have some sort of optical issue. And it's not to say that it's across the board, some are better than others, but this thing so far seems to just do everything really well. And if you think I'm saying that just to say it, you couldn't be any farther from the truth. Illumination there, as you see, is on full, and it's just daytime noticeable. Again, for many of you, that's going to be fine, but again, I'm going to reinforce it. I think the reticle is just way too small here. Very similar to what we saw with like the Sig Tango 4 at 1X. It was like, there's no reticle to be seen. Happily, however, you could easily increase the magnification to anything in between, and you don't have to worry about the drops not lining up or any such sort of optical problems. It's just going to be fine whether you're at 1, 1.1, 1.2, 3, 4, 5, 6, boom, all the way up to its maximum. And here at 50 yards, we see the exact same thing we've seen so far throughout the rest of this video. A very bright, clear, flat-looking, beautiful image. And as you bring the magnification higher, of course, the reticle gets larger, and the illumination is just that much more pronounced. So the higher you have it in magnification, the more noticeable the illumination will be, which is, you know, a plus for sure. Alright, I'm rambling. Let's get on to the Eyebox, finally. Finally! This thing is as good as you're going to get basically for a 1X. Now, with any first focal plane optic, especially LPVOs, if you go into the shadows, the illumination is going to shut off. However, this isn't as bad as the Leupold Mark 6, where if you're slightly off axis, that super bright illumination just completely shuts off, like it never existed. But at least with this, as long as you can see through the optic, you can see the illumination, so it's on par with most first focal plane LPVOs. The 4X on this is pretty standard, actually, and that's comparing it whether it's first focal plane or second focal plane. it's more than adequate. You're going to have a good cheek weld, you're going to get in position, and you're going to be able to see through it. If you're a little bit closer, a little bit farther away, you might have a little bit more shadow, but you'll still have a good enough image that you could at least use it, even if you're in a slightly off-cant sort of environment, which is more than sufficient. The 6x, or maximum magnification on any optic, is going to be tighter. Good cheek weld, consistent cheek weld, consistent positioning will make this a non-issue. Other than that, it's, again, pretty much standard in that regard. One thing about this optic that isn't really sort of standard is actually to do with part of the reticle, and it's the cross. What is the cross really for? Well, it's not there to help you figure out where the center is. It's partly there, this way you could use it when you're shooting at full-size IPSC targets, but it's also very useful if you're shooting at a cant, like you see right here. If you're off on your right shoulder, you don't know where your point of impact is going to be. It just helps reinforce you, all right, this is roughly where your bullet should be impacting, and you could use it as a German post depending on what side you're on. So if you're on your right side, use the bottom right. If you're on the left side, use the bottom left. And you know what? It works very well. All right, it's time to get into my final thoughts and start showing you guys some comparisons that this thing will directly be a competitor to, which is any first focal plane LPVO. And I have a bunch that I did in 1 to 6, 1 to 8, and even 1 to 10. So far, the strengths of this thing are vast. It does everything that it's supposed to do and tries to do exceedingly well. The illumination isn't going to be for everybody. I would personally like a little bit different reticle, or at least a little bit different setup to it. With how it's set up right now, I think it's very, very good. For my own purposes, though, the 1X is still a little bit too small and hard to see, especially for fast, close engagements, which is what most of my shooting is. When I took my P4XI to Woodland Brutality at 1.5x, the thick crosshair and the super bright illumination in the center allowed me to get so fast on target that it wasn't even funny. And even running a bolt gun, I was exceptionally competitive. And it just works for me exceptionally well that way. You might prefer a reticle like this, in which case, this is phenomenal. I don't have to tell you about it. You could see it for yourself. You could see how it's going to look here at 200-yard berm on very small steel plates. It's exceptional. And with that, let's do some side-by-side comparisons, shall we? The first comparison is actually going to be of the Primary Arms SLX first focal plane 1 to 6, as you see here. I didn't give it the best review, but honestly, for the price, it performs all of its tasks exceptionally well. And in fact, the class champion in Partisan at Woodland Brutality was running that exact optic on his What Would Stoner Do carbine and was blitzkrieging everything. So maybe I was a little bit more harsh on it than I should have been, but honestly, for the price, it's one of the best LPVO first focal planes that you can get. And here, it looks fantastic. Next is the Credo AccuPower 1 to 8, and I still praise that thing. I still want to get my hands on one to keep long term, but just hasn't worked out yet. Image quality on it, comparing to this, is very, very close, but I still think the size 6 edges it out by a little bit. It's also, the size also a lot smaller, a lot lighter, but it's not really necessarily set up in the same sort of role. The AccuPower is definitely set up much more as a DMR optic, and in that case, it works exceptionally well. After that's the Leupold Mark VI, which is probably the best looking optic that we have of this entire segment. The brightness, the glass clarity, and sharpness was unparalleled, but that has a 34mm tube, but still manages to stay about the same weight as this size 6. However, the illumination on that, as bright as it was, the second you go off axis, completely disappears and turns into garbage. It's absolutely useless in that regard. But you can't take away how good it is in every other aspect. After that, we have the Gen 3 Razor HD 1 to 10, which I still am not the biggest fan of. I don't care what price they're going for right now. The 1X was the 10X, as you see here, is still Yeah, you see very little of the scope body, which is something I'm a huge fan of, but it just falls flat in so many ways, shapes, and forms. And the reticle, as much as I don't mind it, I prefer the reticle on this size 6 a lot more. The CX9001, blah, 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 blah. After that is the first focal plane Credo 1 to 6. It's It's not my cup of tea. The brightness isn't that great, but neither is the brightness on the size 6, to be brutally fair. But I feel the size 6 has a much more usable, practical reticle for myself. But if you don't like having dedicated drops that are set up for a particular ammunition, cartridge, and rifle that you don't shoot, then something like the Credo that gives you a mil drop reticle like that would be much more substantial. So again, different strokes for different folks. It's what's going to fit your bill better. Last and absolutely least is the 6T first focal plane. The image quality on this, granted it was snowing that day, but the thing just never looked good to my eye. No matter how much I played with it, no matter how much I used it, it just wasn't great. And the reticle at 1x was fairly small. But again, you have the host at 3, 6, and 9, which help a little bit, but I don't know why they're not bigger like the Attacker. You know, the Night Force Attacker does it better than probably anybody else, and I want to get my hands on one because I'm sure I would love it. But anyway, those are some of the comparisons I can show you real quick just to get an idea of what to expect from this thing versus some of the competition. Ultimately, though, what is my opinion of this thing? Well, if you haven't guessed, it's extremely high. Do I wish it had a couple of things a little bit differently? Yes, but SAI had set out to make this optic very, very particular. And the way that they wanted this thing to come out, they hit every nail on the head squarely and firmly. It is exceptional. The glass is really good. The reticle is really good if you like it. The controls are incredible. Granted, the illumination control doesn't go 360 degrees, so that's something that might tick a couple people off. But you know, when you have a hard stop on either end, you know exactly where you are each and every time. So again, I can understand why they did that. The magnification control is very smooth, slick, and fast. It doesn't have a throw lever. I would like to have one on there. It's got a little like thumb ramp, but it's really, really small. Okay, maybe that's a point we can pull away from that. As far as the turrets, they are unbelievable. And the fact that it has that nice little silicone little strap that keeps the caps on, so this way you don't lose them, really, really nice. And it comes with Tenebrex caps that are the same color. They're freaking FDE and they look amazing. But there is one Achilles heel which is probably going to stop a lot of you guys from purchasing this. And that is it only has a 5-year limited lifetime warranty. I don't know how it would really work out. I'm sure this thing would hold up fine, but it's still something to think about. Despite all of that though, is this the best first focal plane LPVO 1-6 I've gotten my hands on? The answer is yes, because it performs every action and task to the fullest level. I really have to thank Jekyll Bob for commenting on, I forgot which video it was, I think it was one of the 6T videos. He's like, hey, you should really find out about getting a size 6 because I think they're really good. And I sent an email, Dave got back to me really quick, and here we are. So Jekyll Bob, thank you so much for making the recommendation. But Dave, thank you so much for coming back to me and talking about me and my channel and making this video series possible. It's been an absolute blast, and I've loved having this thing for as long as I have, using it and just throwing it through its paces. It's worked extremely well. Am I going to keep it? I'm thinking more along the lines of yes, even though I don't have a real use for it, with the exception of using this as a benchmark for every other first focal plane LPVO to come my way. With that, thank you all very much for watching, and as always, see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to help support the channel but don't want to join my Patreon, I completely understand. But you can help by using the affiliate links in the description below. Thanks again for watching.